Hey everyone, welcome to Mythology Explained. Today we're going to be talking about Christopher Nolan's upcoming adaptation of the Odyssey. Now, ever since the trailer first dropped, the film has been making headlines for its questionable casting decisions. And when I touched on these things in my own videos, one of the things that I noticed right away was the Greek response. That is, how actual Greek people feel about it. Sounds important, right? Ever since we started getting real information about Christopher Nolan's Odyssey, the conversation around this film has become increasingly strange. And not just because people are debating individual casting choices. That was always going to happen. This is Christopher Nolan adapting Homer, so naturally people are going to pick apart the costumes, the performances, the armor, the gods, and every tiny creative decision. The Odyssey is one of the most important works of ancient Greek literature, and one of those myths that still feels culturally alive thousands of years later, so of course people care. But the more I look at the film, the more I think the biggest issue with Nolan's Odyssey isn't one specific actor. It's not just Lupita Nyong'o as Helen, it's not just the rumours around Elliott Page possibly playing Achilles. It's not even really about whether one individual performer does or does not match the way people imagined a character. Those debates matter, and I've talked about some of them already, but I think they are really part of a bigger problem. Nolan appears to be making a massive adaptation of the most famous Greek epic ever written, and yet the major cast seems to have almost no visible Greek presence at all. Now, I want to be careful here because saying there are no Greek actors is probably too absolute. There may be Greek actors in smaller roles. There may be people of Greek descent involved somewhere in the cast or crew. The stronger point is that as far as the main public-facing cast goes, Greek representation appears to be incredibly limited. The biggest names attached to the film are not Greek, and the characters being emphasized are not being played by Greek actors. And for the Odyssey, that is very hard to ignore. This is the story of Odysseus trying to return to Ithaca after the Trojan War. It's a poem about homecoming, identity, and the almost unbearable pull of one's homeland. Even when the story leaves Greece physically, its emotional center remains rooted in the Greek world. Odysseus spends the entire poem trying to return to a specific place, a specific household, a specific name, and a specific social order. He isn't just trying to survive, he's trying to become himself again. And that makes it especially strange, almost ironic, for the film adaptation to feel so disconnected from Greekness at the level of its major human presence. Now, the moment you criticize casting in a mythological film, someone immediately jumps to, so what, only Greeks are allowed to play Greek characters now? But that is not what I'm saying. Mythology has always been retold. The ancient Greeks themselves didn't have one fixed, perfectly consistent version of every myth. Homer wasn't writing a modern cinematic universe. Later poets, playwrights, local traditions, and artists changed details constantly. The moral meaning of those stories changed depending on who was telling them and why. Reinterpretation is not some modern corruption of mythology. In a lot of ways, reinterpretation is the reason mythology survives. But flexibility doesn't mean rootlessness. A myth can be universal without becoming generic. In fact, most great stories become universal because they are so strongly rooted in a particular world. The Odyssey doesn't feel powerful because it's a vague fantasy adventure with ancient-looking props. It feels powerful because it comes from a very specific cultural imagination. Its world is shaped by Greek ideas about honor, hospitality, reputation, divine favor, and belonging. You can translate that world, you can bring it to new audiences. But if you strip away too much of its cultural texture, eventually it stops feeling like Homer and starts feeling like a prestige fantasy film using Homeric names. That's why the casting issue feels bigger than the typical internet outrage cycle. It's not just about whether one actor looks the way someone personally imagined a character. It's about the repeated Hollywood habit of treating Greek mythology as an aesthetic warehouse. Ancient Greece is constantly useful as an image. It provides the ruins, the gods, the heroic names, the statues, the monsters, and the sense of grandeur. But actual Greek people are often strangely absent from the center of these adaptations. Ancient Greece becomes this beautiful cinematic dreamscape, while the living cultural connection to these stories is treated as if it barely matters. If a major Hollywood director made an enormous adaptation of the Mahabharata with almost no Indian actors in the central cast, people would obviously notice. If someone made a huge film based on Japanese mythology and Japanese actors were barely visible in the major roles, that would instantly become part of the conversation. Because in those cases, we understand that mythology isn't just old stories, it's cultural memory. Greek mythology often seems to get treated differently because it has been absorbed so deeply into Western education, literature, and pop culture. People sometimes act as though Greek myth has been detached from Greece entirely. It becomes ours in this broad civilizational sense, but that can very easily slide into a strange kind of erasure, where everyone feels entitled to the myth except the people whose culture actually produced it. And yes, the Odyssey belongs to world literature now. Anyone can read it, love it, study it, perform it, translate it, and adapt it. But belonging to the world doesn't mean it stopped being Greek. From what we've seen so far, Nolan seems to be aiming for something massive, grounded, and immersive. The film appears to want weight, it wants scale, it wants the audience to feel the sea, the ships, the violence, the exhaustion, and the strangeness of the journey. I genuinely believe that Nolan wants ancient myth to feel tangible and believable. But once a film asks to be taken that way, questions of cultural texture become much harder to dismiss. You can't build a world that appears to care deeply about physical authenticity, ancient atmosphere, practical detail, and mythic seriousness, then act surprised when people ask why the major cast doesn't seem meaningfully connected to Greece. I even saw Nolan mention the importance of the score in an interview, how music is part of how you make an ancient world feel alive, and I completely agree with that. That is exactly what makes this so strange, because if the sound of the world matters, if the texture of the world matters, if the tiniest creative choices matter in making the audience believe they're entering something ancient and mythic, then surely the people at the center of that world matter too. The more grounded the film looks, the more visible that disconnect becomes, because casting isn't separate from world building. That doesn't mean Matt Damon can't play Odysseus well, or doesn't mean Anne Hathaway can't be a compelling Penelope. It doesn't mean Zendaya, Robert Pattinson, Charlize Theron, Lupita Nyong'o, Tom Holland, Jon Bernthal, or anyone else in the cast lacks talent. Obviously, this is a hugely impressive group of actors, but that's almost part of the issue. The casting feels like a prestige ensemble first and a Greek epic second. It gives the impression that the priority was star power, global marketability, and recognizable names, while the Greekness of the story was assumed to be something the costumes, sets, and locations could supply later. Greek actors do not need to be cast in every role, but it is difficult to understand why a film of this size couldn't find a meaningful space for them in major parts. This is Christopher Nolan making one of the biggest mythological films in years, and if Greek presence had been a priority, it could have been central. Homer was essential, the title was essential, the scale was essential, the famous characters were essential, but somehow the people connected to that tradition were apparently not essential. That's my criticism. Not that the movie is automatically going to be bad or that mythology can never be adapted freely, but that Hollywood often treats ancient Greece as culturally prestigious while treating modern Greek identity as irrelevant to that prestige. And for the Odyssey, all of this feels especially strange, because this is the great homecoming poem. The whole story is about the pain of displacement and the need to return. Odysseus is offered comfort, pleasure, immortality, forgetfulness, and escape, but he keeps choosing Ithaca. Not because Ithaca is perfect, but because it's his. It's the place where his identity makes sense. So if there was ever a myth where place, belonging, and the cultural rootedness should matter, it's this one. Which makes it feel almost painfully ironic that the film's Greekness may end up being more visible in the setting than in the people at the center of the story. Anyway, that's it for today's video. What do you think? Is this a fair criticism of Christopher Nolan's Odyssey, or do you think Greek mythology has become so universal that casting no longer matters in the same way? Let me know down in the comment section below. And as always, make sure to like the video and subscribe to support future content. See you all in the next one.